Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Doug Kirsten about building a security program and instilling a security culture. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. And it's just about time for the news, but first, some announcements. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests. We make it easy. Complete the form, we'll check it out monthly, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. We also have a few webcasts coming up soon. First, join us February 16th to learn about validation techniques within applications. Then join us March 2nd to learn 5 things you can do to catch more bad guys. Finally, join us March 10th for an intro to KQL queries. To register for these webcasts, visit securityweekly.com/webcasts. Plus, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at the quite memorable and easy to find securityweekly.com/on-demand. And this brings us now officially to the news segment, Mr. Kinsella. One thing don't have a link to this, but going to do an initial curveball for you here. We had a big game here in the United States yesterday, a football related game. And one of the topics was QR codes being displayed and InfoSec or AppSec worrying about QR codes. Now, I have an answer here, and we can see if you want to go first or if I shall. But how worried are you really about QR codes in the grand scheme of everything else within AppSec?
I like the way you, the curve on the end there. What do I think? No, seriously, because it's one thing. Are they out there? But to me, I interpret that as how does it affect me, or do I care with all the things I do? I saw I think the version of that story I saw was sometime in the last week or so. But the use case which catches my eye right now is when you go out to, at least here in the US, I haven't traveled internationally for a while, but at least in the US during COVID, it's become pretty common for either a little card or a sticker on each table in a restaurant to have a QR code for the menu. That was the first thing I thought of. And they're just going in and slapping your own sticker on top of that. And it doesn't have to be directly a vulnerability. So I think the way I'd answer this is I don't look at this as show your phone a QR code and suddenly be compromised. I mean, that's there, and you can do drive-bys like that. But what's much more interesting to me is to combine it with a social engineering attack of some type or a phishing attack. So maybe someone goes in that restaurant and they scan and they get the menu, and maybe it looks just like the menu. But I also want there to have a button so you could actually go ahead and order at the table or do something. You can go really have some fun with this without worrying about actually directly doing an attack, right? So just have go ahead and put your credit card number in, put your, specify what you want to order, at least start off your drinks right now. Put your credit card in, we'll give you 25% off, right? You can do something there with that, and you're already having fun without worrying about is there a no day in the phone or something else. So it's definitely, it's the next level. I think we've got one of the things we have in here on one of the stories was talking about deception. I think it was number 1 on the one of these tabs. Yeah, on the Portswigger's top 10 list of issues for 2021. And so I think that's the interesting part to me is deception. Right? We would talk about either URLs that are typoed or packages that are typoed. You're not even typing anything here. You're showing your phone at some little squiggly thing, and you have no clue what it is. So I think there's definitely potential. The question is there actual direct vulnerability in it? And I'm not too worried about that personally, at least. But yeah.
No, that's you handled that. I realize I'm mixing metaphors between curveballs and talking about football games, but that's okay. But yeah, I think I did come from the aspect of honestly a bit of a shrug. I don't see too much of a difference between a QR code and a shortened URL, or just a URL in general, from the perspective of it's pretty much an inscrutable amount of bits or an inscrutable amount of alphanumeric characters, that I will trust my phone and to have a modern sandboxing, modern utilities like checking certificates, making sure not to be downgraded to old TLS versions, things like that. So mostly I'm getting to the aspect of you brought up some really interesting attack scenarios, cleverness that I don't think are necessarily unique to QR codes, but definitely QR codes could be contributors towards. And I think, and the reason I bring this up is from the perspective of security awareness training and the idea of phishing, in the sense of I think it's a lost cause to tell people don't click on a link or don't scan a QR code. Links go back to the RFCs, which we'll talk about RFCs in a little bit too. Links are meant to be clicked on. I think the better security is to talk about, do we have sandboxing? Do we have MFA? Do we have other controls that are helping this ecosystem? Now, admittedly, some of those controls may not be so great, and that's why we still have AppSec jobs and AppSec problems. And not everybody's patched or on the latest version of an Android or iOS. But maybe we'll try to listeners, let us know what you think. Come hang out in Discord and chat with us about where you fall on those perspectives, because we also, as John was just alluding to, have a lot of stuff to go through in the news this week. And one of the news is looking back into 2021. So, John, let's dive into Portswingers and James Kettle and crew throwing in their top 10 list about what they saw of web hacks for 2021. To me, I loved the aspect that it was not just a rehash of the OWASP top 10, and they were looking at, yes, there was cross-site scripting on there, but that was low at the bottom of 10. Let's skip over that. They were looking at HTTP request smuggling, and they were looking at it from implementation issues that HTTP 2 servers and 3 servers, for that matter, still have to talk to HTTP 1. And that's where the problems come from. There was a JSON interoperability vulnerability that we talked about that was really neat, and cache poisoning that I think I had just brought up and talked about back in January. So some really cool stuff there, as well as the dependency confusion, deception that you were talking about. So I'm not sure if you have a favorite off of that list, or there was one that was that made you smile.
The one that actually caught my attention was number 10, was the cross-site scripting, from the point of view that they are doing fuzzing in a browsing to find cross-site scripting. Yes. And I thought that was really interesting. But so, yeah, the rest of the list were, it was nice to see. I want to say we covered most of these at one point or another during the last year. HTTP smuggling, yep. Header smuggling, sure. JSON, plenty about that. So I think it's, and I'm not trying to say like, hey, we're telling you guys everything to listen to. I think it's good for any of us to sort of go, are the topics which have crossed my mind in my industry over the last year, is that sort of what people do when they come up with a top 10 list like this? So I think it's a little bit of validation that we're at least thinking about the right thing. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through and link to all the episodes where we talked about, I think, at least 8 out of 10 of these items. But that'll be some homework for me this week, so you're off the hook for once, John. There is still a theme, but still looking backwards to 2021. I've avoided any 80s references, so I haven't looked that far back yet. But we both had, you mentioned the state of security from Veracode, and Google had some metrics around their vulnerability reward program. Let's hit the one unfortunate thing about Veracode's report, as usual, it's like many of these, it's behind a registration wall to get to the PDF. But the one thing that stood out to me was talking about the half-lives of vulns and how long it takes for they were talking about for third-party vulnerabilities to get to address 50% of them, get them 50% of those vulns to a closed point. Back in 2017, according to their report, it took about 3 years, which is astonishing to hit that half-life point. Now, it's just about a year, which unfortunately is still kind of astonishing in terms of time, but that does tie in to some of those aspects that we were just talking about with Doug. We had an extra long, conversation with him in the last segment. I encourage everyone to go listen if you haven't yet. And one of the metrics near the end he was talking about was looking at the prevalence of vulns related to other bugs, or looking at the time it takes to fix vulns. So that was what stood out to me. So I'm not sure if there's anything there. If you want to skip over to Google's Google stacks of cache that they've been paying out.
Nope. That's nope on the second. I've got a list on the first one. Let's see. I'm going to go with your half I've got I've got 4 bookmarks from this one. So pretty pictures. I have lots of pretty pictures in here. I can talk about this for a while. So the first one I'll riff off of what you were just talking about, half-life. If you go to the next page on 33, they show half-lives based off the scan type. So dynamic analysis has always been important. Static analysis is starting to get a little greater. SCA has dropped like a ton from where it used to be. So it used to be close to 1,200 days to resolve issues found by SCA, and that's now dropped down to 400 days. And just to sort of give numbers over those 3, dynamic analysis looks like it's always been around, 150 days. Static analysis was around, I'd say 180, and it's gone up to about 220, maybe 300 days. And then SCA went from 1,200 down to 400. So what's interesting about this, we get a lot here, so I'll try and rip through it, but it's showing how both the engineering teams and probably management is looking at these things and prioritizing how to fix. So if they see something being discovered by dynamic analysis, they're like, okay, a scanner found that. That means someone else can find it. Means we need to fix it now. Versus static analysis, they're like, yeah, something's there, but we're not quite as worried about it. So I thought that was interesting. I'm going to back up real quick here to page 21. Really interesting graph, really interesting series of graphs talking about popular libraries by language. So when I was thinking about this, think through, and you're like, okay, well, Go, Python, JavaScript, we've always had libraries has been a core part of the application, and then think of part of the programming ecosystem. And then compare that to, say, like C, C++, where I think 10, 15 years ago, I wasn't doing a lot of importing and third things. And I start looking at the charts with that. Like, okay, yeah, you'll see this sort of Coke bottle for both .NET and actually for Python. I thought that was very interesting, where they, back in 2018, they didn't have as many popular libraries being imported to now it's sort of fleshed out a little more. Same with Java. Ruby went the opposite direction, which is interesting. So does that mean people are using less of at least the popular libraries in Ruby compared to where they are now? So it's sort of an interesting visual bit on there. As I said, I'm going to try and rip through these. On 31, there was a really neat set of graphs talking about software weaknesses found by SCA per language. And you can actually see for Python, PHP, and .NET, there was an increase in insufficient input validation, probably around 2018. And I don't know if this is based off their customers or what's going on, but that didn't hit C++ until about halfway through 2019 during COVID. During COVID, you see there's an overall spike in a lot of these scanners when people start realizing they have to start, scanning this stuff because they're working from home and their software's in the cloud. But it's interesting to see some of these patterns in here on like, Java has a lot more insufficient input validation. They've got their colors different. That's not cool. For the other languages, that same color is information leakage. So it's interesting to see, based off the different languages, you can definitely see a different pattern. And then I'm going to wrap up here with one more, which I thought was very interesting. So on 39, they've got a graph of, they're doing a bit of a sales pitch here at the end, talking about, if you sign up for Vericode's online training, your developers are going to get better and have less vulnerabilities, right? We're all going to agree that's a good thing. So they've got 6 charts, and usually it's a before and after. Before, what percentage of scans finding flaws. So most of them, it's a pretty high number before, and then the idea is after you do your testing, it should go down. Except for C++, they're saying it's not statistically significant. I would say it is. So before it was 87.9% of applications found flaws. Afterwards, it's 92.9. So it's a 5% swing. I would call that statistically significant. Maybe they're only scanning like 3 applications, but I doubt it's very good, right? So, that's I guess at this point all we can do is leave that there as food for thought. But it's a good report overall, even if you're not like me and you actually read it, not just look at the pretty pictures. But I think in a lot of these type of things, if they have something worth saying, I can go to a picture, and I'm visual. Obviously, we've said 10 million times before, so I can sort of look at the graphs and go, oh, that's sort of interesting to me. And but for those who like to read, there's plenty in there to do exactly that.
To do exactly that, indeed. And I did appreciate. I love the creation of interesting graphs, good graphs to tell a story. And I think one of the things I'd be curious too is you were hitting on the point near the end about the impact or the correlation or influence between recency of some security training and amount of bugs found or amount of bugs fixed. What I'd be really curious about is the method of that training, in the sense of, was that training focused on don't do this, don't have XSS, don't have SQL injection, a lot of things about avoid doing this, versus something perhaps a bit more prescriptive in the sense of, I see, here's Microsoft Clippy. I see that you're writing Java. Here's how to do some better authentication or authorization management within this Java library you're using. Or here is, I see you're writing a SQL statement. Here's how to use prepared statements. And those much more prescriptive, or this is what you should do to be secure. I'd be really curious if that training, what side of the fence that fell on and how that was influencing. And it does kind of come back to how I set us up at the beginning of this segment, in the sense of QR codes are phishing, in the sense of just tell people inspect URLs and don't click on suspicious URLs, versus have a password manager, create unique passwords, set up MFA, and keep your system up to date. Much more, there's both are security training, but I think one of those is much more successful over time. Speaking of successful over time, Google has successfully spent almost $9 million on their vulnerability reward program. This is one of those things, once again, you don't necessarily want the highest score in this type of environment, but it is an excellent demonstration of engagement with the researcher community and rewarding the community for disclosing bugs. Just to rip through it real quick, what I focused on about this was more about the payments and average payouts. So under, I believe, Android, the highest payout was a nice $157K for a vuln. Not bad if you found that vuln. On average, it looks like if you're hacking on Android and you get an award from Google, you're looking at almost a $25K payout. On Chrome, you're almost at a $29K payout on average for this research. Now, obviously, there's a distinction here between average and median, so I'd also be curious what the median payout is. But the reason I was highlighting that was just the idea of researchers putting their time, and is that time worth it, or in terms of just a monetary value, as opposed to just pure education. And I'll throw it over to you for your thoughts, as I do also want to mention fuzzers. The fuzzing for XSS stood out for you on the Portswigger's top 10. In here, down in one of the bullet points, was that a Chrome fuzzing program has been pretty active, and one fuzzing report got a 16K reward. So it's nice to see not only is fuzzing in place, but fuzzing is being successful in terms of finding something that is, that's a security vuln, that's a $16,000 worth of a security vuln. So kudos to that. Let's see more fuzzing.
Yes, that reminds me of a little bit of the whole philosophical artificial intelligence, machine learning type thing. So if if a vuln defined by the fuzzer gets 16,000, does that go back to the fuzzer? The fuzzer has to get something out of this. So here's the thought I had sort of reading through it. Yeah, as soon as I saw this 8 million, I'm like, oh, Mike's going to cover this one, so I didn't touch it. But and that's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. But as I sit and look and scroll through here, if I'm going to start doing, if I decide for 2022 I'm gonna survive off doing bug bounties, do I want to look at the area that had 3.2 million and 115 researchers rewarded? Or would I want to focus on the area that had they've changed numbers on me, damn it, that had a smaller number. So and I don't know, maybe it is, the browser might be that target rich that we can keep banging on that for the next year or two, and we can have an okay living. Go move to Fiji, get an internet connection and a laptop with some power, and just bang out a few vulnerabilities every month or two. It's not a bad way to live. So I'm not sure if is it that, or is that now been patched up pretty well, or been the door's been banged on enough that okay, let's go look at something new, like that Titan chip that has 1.5 million price tag on its head. I don't know. It's sort of interesting to think about, to me at least.
Interesting to think about. One of the things on a theme, I'm going to tie in one of the other articles I pulled up, just attacking JavaScript engines in 2022. So if you do want to be part of that 100 or 200 people that have been hacking against Chrome, actually I think it was 115, that was your number, that was hacking against Chrome, and you want to learn JavaScript engines, check out this, unfortunately right now just the slides from OffensiveCon. And skip to the end as I comment in the show notes. There's an exploitation and mitigations section. That's just a nice summary of observations of past security controls, security boundaries, how they worked or didn't work, importantly, for that matter, within basically the two popular or only browser engines. You've got Chrome and Chromium and WebKit. So I wanted to throw that out there. In the show notes, I also threw in two other links to videos from the OffensiveCon's 2020 conference, for that matter. One from Halvar and one from Maddie Stone, whose research we have talked about quite a bit within Google Project Zero. So just some additional cool stuff that I just wanted to highlight. Cons that aren't Black Hat or DEF CON, for that matter. But I know, too, I was kind of trying to tee us up here as I was talking about security boundaries within JavaScript engines, because, John, you've got an article about one of your favorite topics. Tell us about Docker.
Yeah, this is a fun one. I don't think this got a lot of attention last week. At least I didn't see it going through. I just heard about it on another Slack, actually. There's a guy I know up here in the Pacific Northwest, Brian Brake, runs a BrakeSec podcast. So, go check out his stuff. And that's where I heard this. So usually, the Docker ones I usually hear about pretty quickly. And this one, he was the only person I think who's mentioned it. At least, maybe I was too busy and I wasn't watching the Twitters. But so, long story short, well, let's see if we can make it a short story. Docker released a fix for one CVE, 21284 for those playing along at home. And this is from 2021. And in the process of that, they change modded a directory, gave it an execute bit, and that has now resulted in allowing people to be able to execute files in a way which would be considered bad because they've got a capability set on them. So we talk about capabilities, the Linux concept of capability. Usually I'm talking about it from the concept of a running process. So, you give capabilities to a container, to a group of processes which are in a namespace, which is what we think of as a container. That's how it's done. You can also give capabilities to files, not done nearly as often. This is sort of like also, there's a few different file permissions out there that people still never really think about, but this being one of them. And what this would allow you to do basically is to provide heightened capabilities to a process running in a container, which basically allows it to get access outside, possibly. But the more interesting aspect is if you set those capabilities on a file in a container image, that also can run with those capabilities outside. Did I just say that wrong? If you set capabilities on a file in a container image, or a container if it's still running mounted, you're able to access that file from outside the container, you're able to run with those capabilities. So what that would mean in this particular case is that allows you to actually get privilege escalation. So if you can, the example they give of this is the guy went searching through Docker images on Docker Hub, looking for out of 4,000 images, can't remember the exact number he found, but he found several that had these capabilities turned on. Let's see if I can scan and talk at the same time. And really what that allows you to do is, so in particular, one of the ones he found right here, Microsoft MSSQL. So he scanned 2,500 different Docker images, and there was a quote-unquote surprisingly large number of images that had these capabilities. So it doesn't give me a number. But basically, one of the ones he had is containers, binaries in containers that have cap sys ptrace enabled, which allows you to do debugging and hook into other processes, right? You're given that debug capability. One of the ones that had that was Microsoft SQL Server. They actually have GDB in that container image. Why? Usually I don't think of a database needing GDB, but there you go. So basically, long story short, if you're able to download that image onto a system and that directory which it is stored has that 701 permission. That means anyone on the system can can execute. So you've now got a way to be able to go through and increase your privileges on the host. So long way of saying they patched one thing, and as the title on here says, how Docker made me more capable and the host less secure. Where this becomes useful, in most cases, this won't matter too much if you're in a container. If this is in a container or not, from the point of view of if you're on that host and you can get to the image, you're going to be able to run it and get, one way or another, you're going to be able to have privileges on that host. Either running a container with root mounted, and then just you have access to the whole host. That's one way to get through to it. But where the story, what he's saying here is, in certain cases, people go to the trouble of actually trying to harden their systems and have a hardened container environment. And then you have a container image like this that allows you to escalate ahead of where you're expected. So it's a fairly niche thing where you'd actually be able to leverage this from my point of view. But that's sort of what they're thinking about.
No, yeah, thank you for that overview. I think I don't really have anything to add except for a very shallow comment that I wish that we could find some other image to reference Docker and containers than shipping containers. Let's be more creative. So you were a bit more in depth about being creative about how to use these types of vulnerabilities, take advantage of capabilities that possibly don't need to be ascribed to a system, or why is there GDB installed here? Let's minimize the tools there to avoid the living off the land type of attacks. But I'm still going to focus on let's be more creative about the
I'm with you.
Please.
We've had those shipping containers around for, it feels like close to a decade now. So yeah, it's time to. Yeah. It's hard, right? How most of the things we do, how do you visualize it? So
how do you visualize?
Yeah.
Well, speaking of things that have been around even for much, much more than a decade, is artificial intelligence. Now, Mr. Kinsella, do get your jazz hands ready, because we're talking about AI and ML. But I think I may have found something that, to me, honestly, is quite appealing and is not something so easily dismissed as, is that just a regex or is that just a cascade of if statements? Here is some research out of a PhD student who was looking at using natural language processing, NLP, which is basically to gain a semantic understanding of an RFC that's describing a protocol, for example, and then turns that protocol into a finite state machine, then feeds that finite state machine into attacker simulation, which is essentially a nice way of saying fuzzing. One of the open source tools he mentioned is Korg, which, as a synthwave fan, I love the fact that there is something named after Korg, which has an attack button for you ADSR folks and sound envelopes. But overall, we're getting low on time here, but I had to make sure we covered this article because I thought it was really neat and a really smart way to me that demonstrated how do we go from the textual description of a protocol, setting up what the protocol ostensibly thought it was describing, looking at that state machine, and then manually inspecting it, of course, to say, does this make sense? And then as humans go to implement it, or understanding the design, where are all the problems going to come from? And we've seen a little bit of hints of this in HTTP2, HTTP3 in the sense of implementation problems. And this just sounds like a wonderful way to turn an RFC text file into a set of, fingers crossed, fuzzing that's going to eventually get some bug bounties. Now, obviously, I'm skipping over a couple things. It is still required some manual tuning, etc. But for me, this sounds and looks legit. This sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it does. I just read through this one this weekend. I think this is a meaty, good article. I think, which is good for sitting down in a comfy chair with a tasty beverage. It's funny. I keep getting distracted in it because I keep seeing FSM and thinking Flying Spaghetti Monster. So it's not just jazz hands for me. It's really through my poor little brain. But it's they're onto something interesting here, and I think. The question for me, from my point of view, is could you take something like this, the research being done here, and sort of take a step back and then point the jazz hands in a different direction, right? So they're looking at a pretty obviously finite set of issues, or of protocols. But how do you? It'd be interesting to sort of take this concept once they're playing with a little more and get it a little more greased in, and how do you sort of point it at something else and sort of let your children go fly, your pretties, and have their way. I think that'd be interesting to see. And this is probably the beginning of what we're going to see coming for. My guess is this is going to be heavily influencing commercial vulnerability scanners, say, I don't know, 2 to 4 years from now, maybe a little sooner, but probably call it 18 to 36 months. How about that? But I think there's a lot of potential in the paper.
Absolutely, and it's really cool to see because it was now off the top of my head, I just forgot my math, but we saw a couple years ago, was it also 10 years ago? I can't remember now, but the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge that was at DEF CON. So this is sort of an evolution, if you will, or it's definitely within the same spirit thereof. So it'd be wonderful to see more of this and how that influences vulnerability scanning and your source code analysis, for that matter, too. Turn the eyes here to NLP that's understanding both of these semantic, aspects of code that's building up the AST, as well as all those interesting things in terms of the code. Like here's the to do, or here is the code comment, the comment block that's describing here's how the function was supposed to work, but did the implementation actually match up to that? Now we've chatted a lot, and we had actually a lot of news this week. We'll have to do maybe a whirlwind to hit a bunch of the rest. John, what's one that you want to hit up? Make sure we don't forget.
I got to go through at least very briefly the article from Threat Post, easy for me to say, on critical MQTT related bugs. So I think the headline's slightly off here. It's there were issues. So Moxa is they make something called MXView, which isn't that like the name of a keyboard or something else? I know Logic Tech uses MX, but anyways. MXView is a management and a monitoring package for IoT and OT. They use an MQTT server called Mosquito, which I believe is an MQTT designed for IoT. So it's lightweight and small. But long story short, the researchers found a few different finger holes which allowed them to get up in that thing and get some of them administrative privileges. Near and dear to your heart, that is partially due to being able to do a directory or path traversal. So I think that is an example that had nothing to do with MQTT. It's just passing the messages back and forth. They had sanitization and validation algorithms in there, but for some reason they weren't on one particular path. So good job to the guys that actually found that. And then it escalates through a code execution through a few more CVEs. And after you see 2 or 3 different CVEs in an article, your eyes start to glaze over. But that was interesting to me. And then I think one I want to hit very quickly at the end, Twitter has changed. So we've talked a lot over the last year about 2FA, probably many years. Twitter just changed who they use for two-factor authentication. You might be aware of this, I don't know. But what happened is they were using a third-party provider called Mido AG. And it turned out the COO of said company had been selling surveillance access to their networks, which was, I don't think it's actually known if anything bad happened out of that or not. But of the folks that you don't want giving third parties access to, anyone doing anything around authentication or authorization, right? That's super sensitive. You want to make sure you know who's doing it. It's nice, clean, sterile environment. So it seems like something happened there, and that's just something to think about, right? For a lot of these type of things, not just open source, but we need to use some of these third parties commercially to get some of this stuff done in a way that allows us to focus on our job. And how do you think about what they're doing or who they're doing or what guarantees you have around there? It's just something for folks to think about. I thought that was interesting about that from the other side for a few seconds. But that's it. You had an article on AirTags. I don't know if you want to hit that one really briefly.
Yeah, we'll hit that real quick because the AirTags, that covers the aspects that I love to expand product security from just the technical discussions, which there are important technical aspects to this, but also the idea of trust and safety and what is the impact of software and hardware in this case on the people that use it. And we covered AirTags last summer, I believe. When they were initially coming out, there was a lot of legitimate concern about what's their design, how are they going to be created. And it's not that AirTags are necessarily unique in this space, but when you have 1 billion potential devices or more, iPhones basically, that AirTags can talk to, you have a massive amount of network to be able to track people. And so this was demonstrating some, InfoSec industry pushing back on this, talking about the broader aspects of stalkerware and what Apple's response to it in terms of design changes they could make in the sense of making sure that all the people who can see when they are being, when there is an untracked or an unknown AirTag around them isn't just specific to the iPhone ecosystem. So it should be visible to Android. So there's an interoperability aspect to that. There's also an aspect of even just hardware tampering. There was, I don't have the link to it right now, I'll have to throw it in the show notes, but someone on Etsy was selling modified AirTags that had the microphone disabled, or the speaker, disabled. Clearly, explicitly just as here's a speaker disabled AirTag, but implicitly one can guess, I think pretty safely, that now rather than in the AirTag beeping when it's out of distance or it's quote unquote lost, it's going to be a bit more silent, and that lends itself to more of this stalking aspect. So a lot of interesting things around this. So that was my real quick take on this, as well as much I wanted to highlight that we will be focusing on some cool hardware stuff throughout this year. We don't want to just keep our eyes on the web application types of vulnerabilities. How quick did I do?
You did great. Cannot wait for more hardware stuff. What's just interesting about this one is I gave 2 family members AirTags for Christmas. And I remember at the same time having a little bit of I hope that's okay, right? I'm giving it to someone, they're not going to track people, but still, is there, from my little bubble here, I'm not sure how wide or what sort of general thought on them is. Like, is that something people would want to get? So it's interesting to see how a good idea can be taken and not just turn bad, but also the overall effect that has on people's thoughts of that technology. So hopefully they'll clear that up.
Hopefully so. And it speaks to the idea of threat models. And I didn't realize I was doing this at the beginning, how much I could say our theme maybe is threat models. And we're talking about QR codes versus links, threat models, as you were just describing here around AirTags. And the last one, just as a real quick mention, I threw in a report from IOActive and some face recognition or face authentication systems, to be more precise, research that they had done. And it was just really neat to think about what are the different threat models, threat scenarios you have around, do you want to use facial recognition to unlock your device? And they had some cool 2D pictures and 3D printing to go along there. So it was also just a neat lab setup to see the hardware hacking angle of this that was more than just some software fuzzers. So definitely wanted to highlight that, and something that we'll also keep an eye on throughout the year and talk about. So also, listeners, if you do come across similar articles like this or similar research, please let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it, as well as areas that we should highlight for listeners and spread the news on. Here. So I suppose with that, Mr. Kinsella, we'll have to wrap up. Any parting thoughts you want to leave for our listeners on this day?
I'll give one, and I'm going to be bad because I don't have the date in front of me. The call for papers for CNCF, the next KubeCon in Spain, which I was hoping to be at. Don't think it will. Anyways, the call for paper is up in the next 2 or 3 days. So if you're doing something around containers or Kubernetes or cloud native in general, please track that down on the web. I'll probably put it into the Discord, but track that down, submit a paper. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to see you in hopefully in Spain.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. And for everyone else, we've reached the end. It's time to thank you. Like and subscribe. It's the right thing to do. And speaking of lovely things, check out the synthwave and saxophone styling of Alpha Chrome Yayo, especially his Page Me. No show next Monday. Instead, we'll record this Friday, which means we'll see you live this Friday on Application Security Weekly.